Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 2, Configuring Network Operating Systems. In this chapter, I will break it down into three parts. Part 1 is a 15-minute. I'll go over the first probably 15 slides of the presentation. Part 2, I'll go over the second part of the presentation, which is about 15 slides. Part 3, I will do a demo. I will do configuring a Cisco switch for management. And each part 1, part 2, and part 3, I will spend about 15 minutes. All right, so what is Chapter 2 all about? Chapter 2 will be an introduction to Cisco IOS. Cisco IOS is a Cisco operating systems. It's an operating system that Cisco uses in routers and switches. So what are we going to learn about it? We will try to understand features and function of Cisco IOS. I'll try to explain the purpose of some commands, introduce you to how would you access Cisco IOS, how to navigate Cisco IOS, how to get help when needed in Cisco IOS. And if you ask me in part 2, which is more importantly, you will learn, I will try to go over how to configure a brand new switch using Cisco IOS. For instance, some of the things you may learn today, you may learn how to configure a host name using Cisco IOS command, how to set a password, for instance, how to configure local access and also remote access. All right. Finally, we also I will go over how to assign an IP address to a Cisco switch. All right. In this chapter, I'm not going over the routers. I'm going over the switches. And the reason why we need to learn about how to assign an IP address to Cisco switches, because Cisco switches port, unlike routers, they don't get IP address by default. So if you want to assign an IP address, you want to create what we call a virtual, interface. We will go over that once we get there. All right. So first and the most important question is, what is exactly an operating system? I'm not going to go into really lengthy talking about an operating system. You have used other operating systems. You use Windows operating system, probably use Linux operating system, and you use other operating systems. But what is exactly? So Cisco operating systems really is no different than other operating systems that you find in other operating systems. Briefly, I will show you here that the purpose of a Cisco operating system is to allow the end users and application to access hardware. In the end, all what the user wants is access to the hardware, because in the absence of the hardware, user will not be able to do the job. So in the absence of a hardware is almost like a car that does not without an engine. Well, although you have the driver, you can go really far. So how does a user interface with this hardware? The user uses a command line, right? Not a graphical user interface, a command line. An example of command line that Cisco uses a shell. So using a shell, a user will interface with the kernel. Kernel is the heart of the operating systems, right? And the kernel will allow the user to access the hardware and perform whatever task he wants to use. So I repeat, the user use a user interface, or the administrators by some kind of shells, right? Command line shell. The shell sends command to the kernel, and the kernel sends those commands to the hardware, and the user will see the end result of the command that he just executed. All right. Next thing is, if you have a new switch, how would you access it? Well, it depends if it is configured or not configured. In the case if you have a brand new, you just open up the box, new in the plastic, it smells new. So the only way for you really to access it and configure it is using something known as out of band. Out of band is using some kind of console. We're going to do, you guys going to see an example of how we're using a console to configure or to access a Cisco switch in this case. Once the switch has an IP address and a password, then you can use either an SSH, right, or use a telnet. This is known as an in-band. in-band. So in-band, all right, there's an out-band, there's a console port, and there's an in-band once you assign a switch, an IP address, and username, and also a password. This is the only three most common method of interfacing and communicating with the Cisco routers and Cisco switches. An example over here, we're using, in addition to the physical cable, the operating system that you're using, Windows or Linux or Mac, you're going to need some kind of program known as terminal emulator. Example of terminal emulator, there's a PuTTY, right? And there's TheraTerm. If you ask me, this is two of the most common used terminal emulator there. For now, I'll show you right here. If you're trying to SSH, you're going to use the SSH, and then you type in the what you call it, the IP address of the switch if you want. But sometimes this is called an in-band. But for out-band, you may only come right here, select a serial, and then just hit open, and you're going to see that you are in front of the command line of the switch that you're trying to configure. Now, once you find yourself in front of a switch there, or a router in this case, there are two modes. Cisco had embedded two modes in order to configure new devices. One mode is known as a user exec mode. How you know it's a user exec mode? You're going to see that sign greater than over here. Whenever you see this sign here, you know you're in user mode. User mode, you are very limited to what you can do. You can view, but you cannot change. You guys can think of it as probably similar to Windows safe mode if you want, only other mode that Windows support. In the second mode is known as a privilege mode. Privilege modes, you'll find yourself looking at the switch or the router and a pound sign. This is a privilege mode. You have the power to configure and change and do whatever you want to do. Well, most of the time as an administrator, you're going to find yourself right here configuring and doing what need to be done. This is a syntax. It's an example of a syntax or a command that you will be doing on a given Cisco routers or Cisco switches. An example, this is a switch name that you have, and this is a command that you send, and then there's space over here, and then you add your argument. For instance, switch space, show space, IP protocol. Show all the running protocol. Here's another simple example. Ping space 192.168.10.5. So what you're looking here are example of Cisco command structure, or we usually call it as syntax. I want you to remember that Cisco routers or switches are very picky when it gets to what they call it, to the iOS command. If you mistype anything or add space or anything extra, the command will not run. For instance, right here, if you type show and you did not leave space and you type IP, you will get an error because the iOS would not understand what you're trying to say. All right, let's move on to basic device configurations. And right here, you can see the first and the most important thing we do as soon you find yourself in front of a Cisco switch is changing the name. And the reason why you change the name, like over here, because you're going to have multiple switches and multiple floors. And if you don't give them unique names, you would not know which one you're looking at. All right, so once you change a host name, by the way, here you can see the example in the command. In order to do that, you type in enable, and then you move to config to. Watch how you move from the sign greater than, this is a user mode, to a privilege mode, and from privilege mode we move to configuration mode, and we execute the command that we want. In this case, we want to change this switch name to to switch dash floor dash 1, which is this one right here. So this command change this switch name. All right. If you want, now that the switch has a name, you may want to be able to finish the rest of the configuration over the network. Well, one way to do that is configure what we call line console. In a line console, what are you going to do? First, this is line console. You're going to configure, like you see, line console 0. You assign a password and a username. And if anybody try to access, so you're trying to secure local access to your switch. If somebody bring the wire plugged in and want to console to your switch or router will ask for a password. And if they don't know the password, they will not be able to configure or gain a privilege mode to the router or the switch. All right? This is physical local access. You are securing physical local access. If you don't do that, anybody will bring a wire, console, connect to your switch, and they'll be able to do whatever they want to do. Next type of configuration you want is how to secure and protect remote access. If you want to secure remote access, in other words, if anybody try to connect to the switch from remote, or if you want to access this from remote, what we use something known as line VTY, which is virtual switch if you want. And once you do this, you are basically opening or allowing or creating 16 channel or allowing 16 consecutive connections to that device if you want. From 0 to 15 is really 16. And anybody that tries to connect, you will get a password. He'll be asked to put in a password. So in this case, by doing this example, we are enabling remote access to the device, the remote access by using SSH or using Telnet. All right. In here you could see some of the other command that we do when we configure switch. For instance, here, enable secret class. When we do this as privilege mode, configure mode, you have protected or we call it admin access, administrative access to this switch or to this router. In other way, anybody that somehow were able to gain access to the router either locally or remotely, once they want to start configuring it by moving to enable, the Cisco device or the router will ask them for a password. And if they don't have the password, they will not be able to do that. And once you type enable, basically you exit the configurations. Now, exit the configuration. If you type enable, again, you get into the configuration mode. In here, you can see that line console is being configured, and the password is Cisco and is used to log in. In other way, it's really, this command is reversed. You're telling your switch, if anybody try to log in using a console, using the cable, please ask them for a password and make sure that a password is Cisco. And once you finish configuring this 4-line of code, you type exit. And if you could see, it's really similar to what you do if you want to access, if you want to secure remote access, or you want to be able to access the switch from remote. The command that we do here, instead of console, you do line VTY 0 to 15, and this will allow up to 16 remote connection to the switch device. All right, and here we added a little bit more command. It said startup config and running config. It happened if you are while you are working on a Cisco and you want to see the configuration that you start up with, you may be able to do show startup config. If you want to see the configuration that is saved, you may be able to do run config. The sad thing about this, that if somebody gained privilege to your router and they go ahead and type show run config, they'll be able to see your password in the plain text. Right? So if you want to protect against that, if you can protect all the password, Cisco is highly recommending that you use service password encryption. This command will encrypt all credential in a Cisco router or Cisco device. And if the command is being used over here, and then you'd ask for the user or the admin is assigning an IP address for any user that try to gain privileged access to this device or to this switch or to this router. Similar to the same thing that we did under. We are limiting access, and anybody that needs access need a username, need a password in this case. But if you to even add, we would even add a username. So I'm gonna stop right here. This is part 1, and I'll come back later for part 2.